Welcome, Site 310 students. This is a student-requested lecture or commentary related to Chapter 7 in the 7th edition of our course text. I'm quite cognizant of the fact there have been some difficulty for those of you who are using the 6th edition of the text, and this is one resource that hopefully will be helpful to you. Before I get into some of the highlights, I am going to stick to the Chapter 7 slides, and I want to show you where these are in Blackboard before I get into the weeds here. So looking at our course website, here is this week's course. If students click on the Funder materials, you will see materials for each chapter of the 7th edition of the text, including Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is special because it is the new chapter in the 7th edition. That being said, I've now reviewed all of the chapter folders, and for every folder there is an outline of the chapter. There are the flashcards and slides, and finally trigger questions that we may or may not want to use on the discussion board. So I encourage you to, and my thanks to one of you who reminded me of this, I encourage you to make use of these resources, and hopefully my little lecture here today will be helpful to you as well. Okay. Here we are looking at our chapter. This is the 7th edition, and I want to take you quickly through a commentary on the first 21 slides. There are 24 slides in this set. I won't read what you can read, but rather I will say that these 4 objectives of the chapter have to do with some key terms. Think of them as key concepts. And certainly the term stability is important insofar as we've been looking at personality differences heretofore in the semester. And notice that stability is an interesting construct insofar as its consistency. It's what doesn't change, and what doesn't change across situations, and what doesn't change over time. I would hasten to add that this doesn't mean that you will see it in every circumstance or that you can predict particular behaviors from it, but this tendency to react in extroverted or introverted ways, or in neurotic ways, or in psychopathic ways, these tendencies is really what we're talking about in terms of personality stability. Note also that this is very much in the trait approach to the study of personality, which will really plays a central role in our course, but we're moving beyond next week and the week thereafter. So this chapter, which was assigned for the winter recess, is really all about development, and development presupposes that some elements of personality are stable and some, in fact, are not. As far as on the are not side of things, we talk about a state of mind as an aspect of personality in a given situation. But that's a temporary state. We then talk about habits, and habits do express themselves differently across situations and across time. And then most abstractly, we talk about traits and types. So when we're talking about development, we have to look at development of what? And the issue of developmental psych is a course in its own right, but generally what we're looking for here is the key question of what elements of personality are stable, what do change as a matter of maturation, and then finally what can intentionally be changed in the course of psychotherapy or some self-help effort as well. So in general, these will be the principles of personality, continuity, and change. All right, let me see if I can get to the next slide here. Notice, as we're talking about these patterns of stability and change, we are not talking about causes unless we want to take on this extra layer of difficulty. The personality itself is an observable phenomenon, and the issue of causes, the etiology, that's a technical term for it, is a whole sub-area of investigation itself. Certainly we know about temperament. We've talked about the basic big five, and we've talked about various other salient elements of temperament. And on the discussion board, we talked about the distinction between temperament and personality itself. And if all this is a bit overwhelming to you, post your questions on the discussion board, and we'll make sure that we address them, or we'll address them at our workshop. Okay. These are all slides about causes or etiology, and again, I'll leave it to your interest to take us into the weeds on these different variables. Now here's testable item. Notice there are 6 principles in this chapter, and those 6 principles really are the organizing principles of the chapter. So you ought to know, for purposes of testing, what cumulative continuity principle means, as well as you're able to interpret the other 5 principles of change across the lifespan. A good point here that Funder made is that development and stability, even change and stability, are not mutually exclusive, but rather they're quite capable of being co-occurring phenomena. You've learned about cross-sectional studies. Think about cross-sectional studies as snapshots or pictures in time. And of course, in developmental perspective, the whole issue is longitudinal studies as opposed to cross-sectional studies. So from a research design point of view, this is a critical decision point. And indeed, it's longitudinal studies that most distinguish the developmental perspective. Now we turn to the Big Five and what the literature tells us about change scores on the Big Five between the ages of 10 and 60. Again, I won't suggest you get bogged down in these mean scores, but simply to know they do change, even though they also have a degree of stability across the lifespan, both which are supported by particular studies referenced in the textbook. Technical term is the cohort effect, and within longitudinal studies we have to acknowledge the fact that some aspects of personality are very time dependent, meaning they occur at a given age. An example of this, of a cohort effect, might be our current awareness of narcissism as a personality trait, at least in American culture. So narcissism will manifest or express itself in different cultures and at different points in history. So context, again, becomes all important. I said I'd go to 21. We're on number 8 here. This is the quantitative aspect of this, which means these differences are average differences or mean levels. And of course, those are not individual, those are group averages. So extrapolating or interpreting from research on samples, one has to ask, what population are we talking about? What's the level of generalizability? Okay. The fact that personality changes occur not only in childhood, but also throughout the lifespan is a point that goes almost without saying, unless you look at pop psychology and you think about the whole concept of growing up and what that presupposes. Our myths about personality as essentially being formed in the first either 3 years of life, as Freud believed, or as Erikson might suggest, in the first 18 years of life. But this idea of being grown up presupposes a stable personality in middle and late adulthood, and we who are living our lives across the lifespan know that not to be the case. So one could do a research project in this course on personality changes even in old age. Again, the issue of causes, the takeaway point here is multifactorial or multiple causes for a given result in terms of personality patterns. And again, these can be discussed on the discussion board. The causes are in the domains of psyche, social interaction, and indeed biology. That's the biopsychosocial perspective. So testable item is the social clock. And this has to do with normative patterns. Notice, by the way, the similarity between stereotypes, which have their whole identity politics associated with them, and normative patterns, which emerge inevitably as the size of your population grows. We can certainly talk about that on the discussion board as well. This is a key testable term, narrative identity. Please know that. Basically, it's one's own story of oneself. And so this aspect of personality is very much related to self-concept. The difference between narrative identity and self-concept is simply that self-concept is a concept, meaning it is a theory of oneself. It's very abstract, whereas narrative identity has to do more with the self across the time of one's life. This is a developmental perspective, not much help to you. The idea of change, testable item here. Change is not the same as maturation and development, insofar as what is distinguishing feature about change is that it's intentional. It's the deliberate effort to change personality. And of course, from a research perspective, what change is the result of intentional effort, and what change is the result of maturation or the movement to a different circumstance is, of course, the grist for the mill of personality research. But the point being here is, from the point of view of designing studies, one can look at maturation of personality, one can look at intentional efforts to manipulate, really, and change personality, and they're quite different one from the other. This has to do largely with the issue of the effectiveness of interventions, investment of resources, and so forth. And this is a follow-up slide. I might add that in these studies, again, coming back to my earlier point, the kind of variance that one sees that cannot be attributed to intentional efforts is one of the limitations or confounding factors of these kinds of studies. The targeted interventions. The idea, let me just point out, of targeting the modification of personality traits. From the conceptual level, this is a contradiction in terms, in that traits are long-enduring patterns. What's really being referenced here is these are interventions in the expression of traits or the management of traits. So we're really not talking about modifying something that by definition is enduring. And remember the world of personality disorders, which we're going to go to in a few weeks, but rather the expression and management of those traits. So we'll come back to that again. These are all just particular kinds of elements of the change process. The barriers to change, needless to say, are key variables in a study, and much debate about these in any particular kind of personality change study or clinical trial. So when we're talking about designing research, the issue of preconditions, the issues of barriers, the issues of, most importantly, the issues of goals. What we really mean operationally by great change becomes the challenge for research designers, and hence the importance of research design. So this is the summary now. This is slide 19 of the 21, and there are 6 again. The idea that stability is not inconsistent with change, and that in between is this issue of maturity or maturation, so that we build this narrative, either a collective narrative or an individual narrative about personality, knowing that these principles are governing both continuity and change. I might add down here that I didn't mention earlier, the issues of plasticity and role continuity. Plasticity you probably know of as resilience, or the ability to return to a pattern given a traumatic or a major life intervention. And then the issue of roles. Notice roles are not personalities. Even gender roles are certainly not elements of personality in and of themselves. So we come back, and it's a good place to complete this lecture. We come back to this issue of personality, meaning persona, and the performance of roles, but having a personality that is one's toolbox in carrying out or conducting these roles. The outcome of the evolution of personality, we think about identity, and again, the distinction between identity, personality, and personal narrative is all important. And so, again, my final suggestion for your test on this is to know something about these principles of personality, or to ask about them on the discussion board. And I'll be happy to elaborate, give examples, and clarify as we go forward. I'm going to wrap up this lecture now with something about a quiz on Chapter 7. I have extended the deadline on that, so hopefully you will be taking your time and doing that quiz when you feel prepared to do it. If you have it done by the end of April, you will be fine. This issue of 2 editions of the text was problematic, and I didn't properly prepare for this, so we're doing a little bit of adjustment as we go along. Okay, this is the question of the evaluative. Whether it's good change or bad change is a whole different question then. Is it intentional change? So I will stop there. Say thank you for looking at this lecture. I don't often give lectures that are purely content focused, but hopefully this one will be useful to those of you who have the absence of this chapter in the 6th edition. Thank you.